I remember the evening by its temperature first, not its events. A faint, persuading cold had settled across Oxford, the sort that crept beneath scarves and coats with a strangely ceremonial patience. Snow had begun its tentative descent, drifting past the lamps outside St. Anselm's Hall, like scraps torn from some forgotten manuscript. I had been walking without purpose toward the old stone gate, an archway so often photographed by tourists that it had lost the dignity of secrecy, when something in the hush of the place made me pause. Perhaps it was the snow, or the hour, or a loneliness I never quite admitted to myself. But I stood there longer than I intended, listening to nothing in particular, and that was when the echo reached me. 2 knocks, not loud, not hurried, just 2, spaced with a deliberation that felt curiously intimate. They seemed to come from behind the gate itself, though I knew perfectly well that no hallway lay directly beyond it. Sound does strange things in old colleges. I waited for a 3rd knock, some confirmation that I hadn't imagined it. None came. Lewis later asked me why I hadn't investigated immediately, and I gave him the sort of evasive answer he'd long since learned not to question. The truth was simpler and more pitiful. The knocks reminded me of a time, decades earlier, when someone had once signaled to me in the same manner. A woman with a soft voice and an exquisitely sad smile, who had understood how little I wished to be disturbed and yet how much I yearned for it. Memory has its own acoustics, and that night they resonated more sharply than the present. I continued my walk toward the main quad, noting the usual detritus scattered across the flagstones, crushed packets of cigarettes, the sullen remains of a takeaway cup, footprints that grew blurrier as the snow thickened. The porter's lodge glowed amber in the distance, a fragile refuge of warmth and gossip. Inside, I found old Rawlings hunched over his radio, listening to a brass band rendition of a hymn I disliked even before I recognized the tune. He greeted me with the stiff courtesy that porters reserve for policemen, respectful, wary, faintly conspiratorial. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there had been a disturbance the previous night. An unusual one, he claimed, though he often inflated trivialities into minor epics. A man had knocked at the gate well past closing time, not once, but twice, in that same divided cadence I had heard. Rawlings had gone to the gate, naturally, but by the time he reached it, the man had disappeared, leaving no more trace than a swirl of frost on the handle. Rawlings chuckled and suggested it might have been a prank, though the laugh failed to reach his eyes. I asked what the man looked like. Rawlings hesitated, as if assembling the features from memory required more effort than usual. Shorter than average, wrapped in a thick scarf, face obscured. He thought the scarf was patterned, though he couldn't be sure. He added that the knocking had sounded expectant, a word I found intriguing. Most people wouldn't describe sound that way. It belongs to those who listen for meaning rather than noise. On the porter's desk lay a half-folded newspaper, the ink faintly smudged by Rawlings's damp fingers. A headline near the bottom corner caught my eye. Lecturer missing after failing to attend seminar. The article was brief, written with that brittle efficiency the local papers reserve for academic eccentricities. The man, one Dr. Adrian Fell, had last been seen entering Oxford for a short series of talks. No evidence of foul play, the article insisted. They always insist that, until proved otherwise. Something in the story bothered me less for what it said than for what it tried to avoid saying. Not the disappearance. That happens more often than the public imagines, but the odd tone of detachment in the account, as if the writer felt the lecturer's absence were embarrassing rather than alarming. I tucked the thought away. Most ideas arrive before they make sense. Walking back through the court, I glanced at the snow collecting on a bench beneath a skeletal ash tree. A crossword someone had abandoned lay stiffening in the cold, half completed. One clue. Sound twice, truth once. hovered at the edge of my attention. It felt like the sort of thing Fell might have enjoyed, or the sort of thing a man would leave behind if he intended others to notice his absence. The night deepened. Oxford withdrew into its stone quiet. I heard no more knocks, but the echo lingered, persistent as regret. I was called back to St. Anselm's the following morning, though morning is too generous a term for the grey residue that passed itself off as daylight. Oxford looked washed out, as if the night had taken more from it than it intended. Lewis arrived at my door with a sort of careful enthusiasm that made me feel older than I was. There had been a discovery at the Hall, he told me, and he spoke with that subdued urgency he adopted whenever he feared the news would irritate me. Irritation was the least of my responses. The porter had let us into the guest corridor with a reluctance that suggested superstition more than protocol. The floorboards groaned beneath our steps. Old wood, old grievances. At the far end lay room 3B, its door ajar, as if uncertainty itself had pushed it open. The air inside was cold enough to sting the fingertips. I remember that detail because I paused on the threshold, aware of a faint smell of stale soap and something metallic beneath it. Lewis noticed me noticing it, though he wisely said nothing. The man on the bed looked smaller than his reputation. Adrian Fell, visiting lecturer, expected to deliver a talk on Renaissance ciphers. His face held a strange calm, as though sleep had crept up on him and persuaded him to surrender. There were no dramatic signs of struggle. His hands rested lightly on his chest, almost devotional. But death, even the peaceful sort, always leaves a question hovering like dust in a shuttered room. I moved closer, studying the scene with that mixture of intimacy and estrangement I had never learned to soften. A glass of water sat on the bedside table, untouched. A suitcase at the foot of the bed, poorly packed, shirt cuffs protruding with the carelessness of a man in haste. I examined his shoes. They were unlaced, positioned unevenly. One slightly turned inward as though put down by someone who did not know the man's gait. And there, half hidden beneath the sole of the left shoe, lay a folded sheet of paper. Lewis retrieved it and handed it to me without comment. A crossword puzzle again, this one almost entirely blank, save for a single answer penned in Fell's spidery handwriting. The answer itself meant nothing to me then, but the placement, tucked away, half crushed under footwear, felt wrong. Crosswords are treated tenderly by those who love them. The porter appeared behind us, muttering about the man who had knocked twice. He claimed Fell had arrived after hours, yet Fell's coat was neatly hung and dry. No snow melt, no trace of a late-night struggle with the elements. I asked Rawlings about the scarf he'd mentioned the previous night, and he looked troubled, as if naming it would somehow deepen his involvement. Patterned, he repeated. Dark blue with lighter stripes. I glanced at the coat. No scarf, no indentation where one had been placed. I let the discrepancy settle into the back of my mind. Lewis searched the desk and found Fell's small leather notebook. Sparse entries, fragmented phrases, and on the final page an unfinished line that struck me with its quiet menace. He will knock, but not as himself. The rest of the sentence dissolved into a jagged scrawl. I told Lewis to bag the notebook and called for the forensic team, though something in me already doubted they'd find anything comforting. St. Anselm's was beginning to stir by then. A don hurried past, pretending not to see us. A student attempted a curious glance and then thought better of it. The hall had that defensive stillness particular to academic institutions when scandal approaches. I stepped into the corridor, aware of the thin carpet muffling my shoes. A place designed for silence, not truth. Outside, snow had retreated to a fragile crust along the edges of the quad. I looked toward the stone gate, remembering the 2 knocks from the night before. Memory echoed them with unsettling precision. I asked Rawlings whether Fell had been expected earlier, and he confirmed it. Fell was due in the afternoon, had not appeared, and yet someone had insisted on entering long past midnight. As Lewis returned to my side, I found myself studying the guest register. Fell's signature appeared clean, economical. The line above it, however, caught my eye. A signature too elaborate, too performative. And written, I realized, in a hand trying very hard not to be recognized. It was then I felt the first cold flicker of the truth, faint as breath on glass, refusing to form, but impossible to ignore. I've often thought that academics lie more delicately than most people. They lace their deceptions with footnotes, temper them with irony, wrap them in half-remembered quotations that sound truthful, simply because they are old. That morning at St. Anselm's, as Lewis and I made our way through the upper corridor to interview the 3 scholars most entangled with Adrian Fell, I felt that familiar weariness descend. Not dread, not irritation, something quieter. The sense that what awaited us behind each door would not be falsehood outright, but a soft bending of memory, angled just enough to avoid responsibility. Professor Lane received us first. Urbane, silver-haired, impeccably composed. His room smelled faintly of bergamot and dust, the scent of a man who read more than he slept. He greeted us with a polished sorrow that felt too quick, too complete, as though he had rehearsed the appropriate tone. He spoke about Fell with a measured admiration that lacked weight. Fell had been brilliant, he insisted. Brilliant, difficult, occasionally erratic. While he talked, he ran a thumb along the spine of a book on his desk, repeating the gesture whenever he drifted from certainty. A small tick, but revealing. People fiddle only when they want to keep their hands from betraying them. Lane mentioned a disagreement they'd had years earlier over a translation of a Renaissance cipher. A harmless dispute, he said, academic rough and tumble. Yet the way his gaze flickered toward the window whenever he said harmless told me there had been more attachment or more injury than he allowed. When I asked where he had been the previous night, he replied promptly, almost too promptly. A dinner with colleagues at another college. A pity, he remarked, that Fell had arrived only to vanish so abruptly. His voice softened, but the softness felt like velvet over a locked box. Dr. Mirabelle Shaw waited in the adjoining office, her posture precise, her expression carved from something pale and guarded. She possessed that unsettling calm certain scholars cultivate, the calm of someone who has spent too long with books and too little with people. Her room was immaculate, nothing out of place except a single loose page on the desk, weighted by a fountain pen. She watched me notice it. She watched everything. She spoke of Fell with clipped civility. He was a man who enjoyed provocation, she said, particularly when discussing literature he did not understand as intimately as he believed he did. Her disdain was cool, but beneath it I sensed a tiredness that had nothing to do with Fell's scholarship. When I asked if she had seen him recently, she paused, long enough for the silence to speak. "Not in yours," she said at last. But the hesitation betrayed something, memory, guilt, perhaps grief's shadow. I couldn't place it. When I asked about the photograph from the late 80s, she shifted her pen a fraction of an inch, as if anchoring herself to the desk. I made a note of that shift. People reveal truth in the smallest movements. Edwin Parr, the bursar, was waiting in a cramped office that smelled faintly of paper mold and stale tea. His hands trembled when he spoke, though he tried to disguise the tremor by adjusting his spectacles repeatedly. Parr insisted he had respected Fell, valued his visits, found him witty. Yet he could barely maintain eye contact. He rambled about budgets, failing roofs, benefactors who promised help and delivered nothing. When I pressed him about Fell's recent meeting with him, he blanched. A routine discussion about archival storage, he claimed. His voice quivered as though the lie were lodged somewhere behind his teeth. As Lewis and I walked back through the cloister, the snow outside brightened the courtyard to a faint glow. I felt the case tightening, though not toward clarity. Each scholar had lied, but not about the same thing. Lane's lie tasted of pride, Mirabelle's of sorrow carefully hidden, Parr's of fear, the primitive kind that grows in men who carry financial ruin like a secret disease. Lewis muttered that at least we had 3 plausible suspects. I told him suspects were never in short supply. It was truth that tended to be rationed. I found myself thinking again of the crossword hidden beneath Fell's shoe, the solitary answer he had filled in. A single word standing alone as if it were the key to a riddle none of us had yet learned to read. Oxford's bells began their slow toll across the rooftops, and in the lingering echo I felt the shape of something unresolved, something faintly shifting beneath the polished surfaces of the hall. A lie, yes, but not the one any of them had spoken aloud. It was Lewis who told me, with that quiet reluctance he adopts when he knows the news will unsettle me, that a similar report had surfaced some miles north of Oxford, a small inn near Woodstock. A man knocking twice at a room that was not his own, late at night before disappearing without explanation. I felt the information settle into me like a cold draft under a poorly fitted door. 2 knocks again. Same rhythm, same ghostly confidence, as if someone were practicing a ritual meant only for the ears of the reluctant. We drove out that afternoon beneath a sky that could not decide whether to thaw or harden. The fields were brittle with frost, the hedgerows dark, the road strangely empty for that hour. Lewis tried to make conversation, but my thoughts kept sliding back to Fell's unfinished line. He will knock, but not as himself. I repeated it silently, testing the weight of each word. They felt less like a warning than a confession made too late. The inn sat low against the roadside, its timbers warped by years of weather and neglect. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old ale and something sweetly decaying. The landlord, a tiny, short man with a worried brow, guided us toward the room where the knocking had been heard. His account was simple. A guest, a graduate researcher named Daniel Kersey, had complained that someone had rapped twice on his door around midnight. When he opened it, no one stood there. A few hours later, Kersey vanished without collecting his belongings. The landlord confessed all this in that hushed tone people use when recounting stories they fear may implicate them in something unnameable. Kersey's room felt oddly preserved, as though its occupant had stepped out for a moment intending to return. A coat draped over a chair, a notebook open on the desk, ink trailing off mid-sentence. I touched the paper. Cold. Too cold for writing, abandoned only briefly. The notebook contained half-legible scrawls, notes about Renaissance cryptography, and a reference to a lecture Fell was scheduled to give. Lines connected names. One arrow pointed directly from Fell to a phrase that made me pause. Double call, single truth. It echoed the crossword clue tucked beneath Fell's shoe. Sound twice, truth once. A pattern, however faint. Lewis asked what I made of it. I told him patterns were dangerous things. They seduce the mind into coherence before the facts deserve it. Yet even as I said this, the echo of the knocks tightened its hold on my thoughts. I imagined Kersey hearing them. 2 taps, not urgent, not hesitant. Measured. Intimate. As if delivered by someone who believed the door should open simply because they wished it to. We spoke again with the landlord, who remembered a man standing in the hallway earlier that evening, a scarf wrapped high around his jaw. Average height, maybe a little less. Nothing distinctive except his stillness. That was how the landlord described it, as if the man were waiting for someone but unwilling to announce himself. I noted that word again. Stillness. It is rarely a natural state. More often it conceals tension. Outside, the air stung with a sharpened wind. I watched a curl of frost drift from the eaves and break apart before reaching the ground. There are moments in a case when the world appears unwilling to reveal anything, and yet something within it stirs at the edge of vision. I felt that stir now. It wasn't certainty. Certainty is a luxury I've never trusted, but a faint pressure in the mind, like the first movement in a long, reluctant symphony. On our way back to Oxford, Lewis remarked that Kersey might have run away from something. Students vanish for all kinds of reasons, he said. Stress, affairs, debts. I listened, but felt unconvinced. People do not vanish after hearing 2 deliberate knocks, unless the knocker belongs to someone they know, or someone they fear, or someone they once hoped to forget. The city greeted us with its familiar resignation. Lamps flickered. The river lay still as a sheet of tarnished glass. St. Anselm's rose ahead, austere against the fading light. As we walked through the gate, I felt the echo return, an echo not of sound, but of intention. The repetition of the knock was no coincidence. It was a summons, a signal passed between men who shared something unspoken. And I knew, with that uneasy intuition I have long resented, that the next time I heard it I would not remain a bystander in the snow. Even now, when I think of that photograph, I remember first the peculiar stillness of the room in which I found it. St. Anselm's archive was housed in a narrow chamber where the air never quite warmed, no matter how persistently the radiators rattled. It smelled of time in a way that only old paper can, brittle edges, ink fading into sepia, the faint whisper of fingers long dead. Lewis complained about the cold, muttering something about Victorian inefficiency, but the cold suited me. It sharpened the senses, pared away distraction, made the past feel nearer than it had any right to be. The photograph itself lay buried in a stack of college memorabilia, its corners softened by years of handling. A group of scholars stood shoulder to shoulder on the steps of the hall, each one attempting to appear both distinguished and indifferent. Fell was there, younger and leaner, a sardonic half-smile tugging at his mouth. Lane, too, his posture straighter, his hair darker, his expression already carrying that hint of cultivated sorrow he would later perfect. And behind them, almost lost in the blurred margin, stood a young woman whose face seemed half-turned toward the camera, half-turned toward Lane. It was her hand that caught my eye. Even in the slight blur, the gesture was unmistakable, fingertips grazing Lane's elbow in a way both discreet and intimate. The sort of touch exchanged by 2 people aware that their closeness needed hiding, but unwilling to extinguish it entirely. I felt something tighten in my chest when I saw it. Not recognition exactly, but a familiar ache. Regret has its own vocabulary, and sometimes it speaks through the gestures of strangers. Lewis, oblivious to the nuance, remarked that the woman looked faintly like Dr. Shaw. I'd already seen it, the same sharpness of cheekbone, the same cool intelligence in the gaze, even softened by the lens. Yet the woman in the photograph appeared warmer than the Mirabelle Shaw I knew, less fortified by disappointments. When I asked her about the photograph later that afternoon, she regarded it with a stillness that told me more than any words she might have offered. She shifted her pen, a tiny, defensive movement, as though anchoring herself to the desk before memory pulled her elsewhere. She said she knew nothing of the image, nothing at all, but the slight tremor in her breath, the way she avoided looking at Fell's face, betrayed a truth she wasn't prepared to share. I left her office with the photograph tucked carefully inside my coat, the paper crackling faintly as I walked through the cloister. Snow had begun again, falling in hesitant flakes that gathered, along the stone ledges like unspoken apologies. I found myself thinking of the woman in the photograph, who she had been, what she had meant to Lane, and by extension, what she had meant to Fell. People do not linger in old college photographs without leaving their shadows behind. In my office, I spread the photograph beneath the lamplight. The warmth of the bulb deepened the sepia hues and sharpened the contrast between the faces. I traced the outlines with my eyes, noticing the peculiar spacing, the way Fell stood slightly apart from the others, as though keeping a distance even in youth. Lane leaned subtly toward the woman, and she toward him. a small triangle of affinity, invisible at a glance, unmistakable when studied carefully. It was then that another detail surfaced, faint but insistent. Just above the woman's shoulder, a blurred inscription etched into the stone column. Most would have dismissed it as weathering, but I had spent enough hours with college masonry to recognize a deliberate hand, a set of initials scratched lightly into the surface. The last letter was uncertain, but the first two, M and S, stood clearly enough. Mirabelle Shaw, or someone with the same initials. The possibilities flickered, delicate as candlelight. A deduced connection is dangerous when it forms too quickly, yet sometimes intuition moves ahead of logic, tugging at you until you follow. I thought again of Fell's unfinished notebook line. He will knock, but not as himself. Was it a warning, a confession, a memory resurfacing? And how did the woman tie into it? Her hand, her initials, her hidden place in Lane's past. Lewis interrupted my thoughts with a stack of reports he insisted I read. I told him to leave them on the desk. As he walked out, he glanced at the photograph and remarked that academic lives were never as dull as they pretended. I said nothing. He was right, but truth in Oxford rarely arrives with the courtesy of clarity. I looked again at the woman's blurred face, at the gesture frozen forever on the steps of St. Anselm's. A private history lingered there, something bruised and unresolved, and I felt, with a quiet certainty I could not yet justify, that her story, whatever shape it had taken, would lead us deeper into the echo of those two persistent knocks. I have often found that the dead leave behind two kinds of documents, those written to be read, and those written in the hope they never will be. Fell's unfinished will fell squarely into the second category. Lewis brought it to me late in the afternoon, his coat still dusted with the remnants of thawing snow, his expression tinged with that faint eagerness he carried whenever paperwork promised clarity. I envied him that optimism. I'd misplaced mine long before. The draft lay on my desk like an abandoned riddle. The paper was crisp, too crisp for a man who had supposedly wrestled with the decision for weeks. Fell's handwriting marched neatly across the page, naming beneficiaries with an almost bureaucratic detachment. But it was the final clause that interrupted the rhythm. His rare book collection, 18th-century cryptographic texts, fragile first editions, was to be left to Lane. Not the college, not a library. Lane. A personal bequest weighted with sentiment or guilt or both. Lewis murmured that it gave Lane motive enough to murder. I told him motive was rarely that obliging, and besides, the will had not been notarized. It was a draft, nothing more. Something Fell had contemplated but not executed. People often write wills they do not mean to keep. They reveal more of the writer's unrest than of their intention. Still, the detail bothered me. I reread the clause several times, letting my thoughts drift toward the spaces between the lines. Why would Fell return to Oxford with such a change in mind? Why involve Lane after years of strained civility? Why now, in the precise week of that strange double knock? The pieces resisted alignment, like puzzle fragments from different boxes. I spread the other papers from Fell's suitcase across the desk. Receipts, lecture notes, drafts of letters he had never sent. One letter caught my attention. Written to the college bursar but unsent, its tone oddly strained. Fell apologized for a delay in processing archival materials. He mentioned miscommunications, uncertainties, a misfiled document now recovered. That phrase, misfiled document, hovered uneasily in my mind. People seldom misfile things accidentally. More often they hide them in places respectable enough to pass as error. As I read, the room grew dim, the early winter dusk drawing its veil over the windows. I disliked switching on the lamp too soon. There was something comforting in the half-light, the way it allowed thoughts to loosen and drift. I let my mind return to the will. An unfinished legal document is a peculiar object. It tells you what a man feared might happen more than what he hoped would. Fell feared something. That much I could feel in the dryness of the ink. Lewis asked whether we should speak to Lane again. I told him we would, but not yet. Lane was too polished, too controlled. You do not confront a man like that without letting him tangle himself first, preferably with his own eloquence. Lewis accepted this with a nod, though I could sense his impatience simmering beneath the surface. Once he left, I turned my attention to the will a final time. A faint indentation in the paper caught my eye, an aborted sentence scratched out so thoroughly the fibers had nearly torn. I held the page toward the window, letting the last scraps of daylight reveal what little remained. Only a single word was legible. Reconsider. Whether Fell intended to reconsider the bequest or reconsider something far more dangerous, I could not tell. The evening deepened. I poured myself a small whiskey, the kind that warms the throat while doing nothing for the soul. Outside, the quad lay empty, the snow settling into a fragile crust over the flagstones. I thought of Fell in his final hours. A man drafting a will he never finished. A man knocking at a door not his own. A man carrying secrets tied to Lane, to shore, to that woman in the photograph whose hand told a story none of them wished to repeat. I set the glass aside and returned to the draft. Something was missing. Not a clause, but a presence, a witness. The signature line for the second witness, the one required by law, was blank. But the line meant for the first bore a faint indentation, as though someone had once signed and then pressed the pen hard enough to erase themselves without tearing the page. That erased signature unsettled me more than any bequest. People do not remove their names unless they fear being remembered. The will hadn't been changed, but someone, somewhere, had wanted it to be. The day I found the gap in Fell's diary, the sky had settled into that colourless grey Oxford wears when it wishes to remain inscrutable. I had taken the notebook from evidence storage myself, ignoring Lewis's suggestion that we wait for the formal transcription. Patience is a virtue only when time is not quietly fleeing, and time, in this case, felt evasive. I carried the diary to my office like a fragile relic, aware of its deceptive weight. Objects can be heavy with omission. The diary pages were thin, almost translucent, covered in Fell's precise academic script. He had written sparingly, as though rationing his thoughts. Most entries concerned routine matters, travel plans, lecture outlines, cryptographic theories scribbled with the weary enthusiasm of a scholar who no longer believed in revelation but continued to chase it out of habit. Then the entries darkened. A shift so subtle it might have gone unnoticed had the ink not deepened, as if pressing harder helped him keep his thoughts from escaping. I reached the week before his death. The pages grew denser, the handwriting more erratic. He noted a meeting with the bursar, Tuesday at 4, a detail that tugged faintly at me. But the next page was missing. Neatly cut. Not torn or ripped, but removed with the care of someone who wanted the absence to appear accidental to anyone less attentive than I. A single gap, sandwiched between two otherwise ordinary days. Lewis appeared in the doorway, carrying tea he pretended was for both of us. He asked if I had found anything. I told him I had found nothing, which in cases like these was often the most telling discovery. He leaned over the desk, brow furrowed. He asked if I thought Fell had removed the page himself. I replied that men rarely curate their own silences so neatly. It is usually someone else who tidies up their ghosts. After he left, I examined the binding more closely. A faint residue of adhesive clung to the inner crease. Whoever removed the page had pressed their thumbnail hard enough to lift the fibers. There was no trace of tearing, only the disciplined precision of someone accustomed to handling documents without leaving evidence behind. I thought of Lane then, of his immaculate office and measured poise. But I thought of Pa as well, hands trembling, voice cracking under the weight of hidden guilt, and Mirabelle Shaw, whose stillness could conceal more than sorrow. I placed the diary beneath the lamp, angling the light across the inner margin. Sometimes the ghost of a page remains even when the page itself has gone. Impressions reveal more than ink. After a moment, faint indentations emerged. Nothing coherent, just fragments. A curve of a letter, the tail of a word, a pattern of pressure. The strokes were quick, almost frantic. Fell had written in haste, perhaps agitation. A man trying to record something he feared might disappear before he could fix it to the page. One indentation caught my eye. A single downward line, unusually heavy, as though the pen had paused there, hesitated, punched harder, resumed. A name, perhaps, or the beginning of one. I traced it with my fingertip, aware of the futility. But a detective's work lies as much in listening to silence as in interpreting sound. Later, Lewis returned with a stack of emails recovered from Fell's account. Most were mundane. A colleague asking about citations, a student requesting a meeting, an automated reminder for a conference. But one email stood out. Brief, tense. From Pa. It referenced the same Tuesday meeting, insisting the matter was resolved and that there would be no further discussion. The phrasing, no further discussion, held the brittle bareness of desperation. I wondered whether Fell had agreed, or whether he had intended to record otherwise on the missing page. The afternoon light dimmed. Rain began to patter against the window, soft and rhythmic, the sound of quiet insistence, the kind of rain that coaxes old memories to the surface. I sat back, letting the diary rest on the desk like a sleeping animal. I thought of the photograph again, of the initials carved into stone, of the woman who had hovered at the margins of their youth. Threads pulling from different corners of the past, converging into a knot I could not yet untangle. And then I remembered something small, almost petty. Fell's crossword clue. Sound twice, truth once. A clue not about noise, but about erasure. 2 knocks, 1 truth, 1 silence. A page removed, a name hidden. A man vanishing not only from life, but from the record kept in his own hand. In the quiet of that moment, I felt the shape of what the missing page might have contained. Not an answer, but a direction. And directions in murder are more dangerous than confessions. The conversation with Mirabelle Shaw returned to me that night with the persistence of a melody one does not wish to remember. I'd recorded the interview out of habit rather than necessity, yet as I sat alone in my office, the tape playing in its soft mechanical murmur, I found myself listening not for the content of her words, but for the spaces between them. A voice reveals more by the way it withholds than by the way it speaks, and her voice, measured, crisp, almost luminously composed, held too much poise for a woman confronting the death of an old acquaintance. It was the pauses that unsettled me. Not long enough to suggest hesitation, nor short enough to pass unnoticed. They were the pauses of someone selecting language with surgical caution. She spoke of Fell politely, clinically, as though recalling a former colleague whose existence had long ceased to matter. Yet the recording betrayed something her face had concealed. A faint quiver at the edges of certain syllables, a tightening of breath when his name appeared, as if memory pressed against her ribs from within. Lewis, who had stayed later than necessary, leaned over the machine and asked whether I thought she was lying. I told him people rarely lie in the obvious ways he imagined. They lie by omission, by modulation, by shaping their voice to fit the version of themselves they wish others to believe. I replayed one segment, her denial of knowing why Fell had returned to Oxford, and felt again that soft click in my mind. A misalignment, a shadow obscuring something delicate and dangerous. When Lewis finally left, I poured a small whiskey and let the city settle into its nocturnal hush. Rain tapped faintly at the window, a thin percussion barely audible against the hum of the tape. Oxford has a particular stillness at night, a stillness that feels almost ecclesiastical, as though the stones themselves keep vigil. It was in that quiet that Mirabelle's voice revealed its flaw. On the third replay, I caught it, a shift in cadence when she mentioned her sister. She had spoken the word sister with a firmness bordering on defiance, as though it were a name she had trained herself not to flinch at. Her next sentence came too quickly, almost in retreat. That was the moment I knew the photograph had wounded her more deeply than she had allowed. The woman whose hand had brushed Lane's elbow, the woman with the blurred, tentative smile, was not merely reminiscent of her. She was the same blood, the same history. I turned off the tape and sat in the fading warmth of the lamp. Families leave marks on one another more indelible than any inscription in stone. Whatever had bound Fell, Lane, and that young woman together had left scars that time had not succeeded in softening. Grief alters voices, but so does guilt. I walked the corridor outside my office, listening to the building settle into its wooden breaths. Old floorboards murmured underfoot, each creak a small confession. My thoughts drifted toward Lane's refined composure, the way he had toyed with the spine of that book during our interview. A small, repetitive gesture meant to mask unease. His reaction to the photograph had been too elegant, too polished, as though his grief, if grief it was, had been rehearsed years before. Later, unable to sleep, I returned to Fell's effects. Among them lay a letter he had begun but never sent, addressed to an unnamed colleague. I read the lines with a fatigue that felt deeper than tiredness. He wrote of past wrongs, of a truth buried beneath layers of academic courtesy, of a debt he feared could no longer be repaid. And at the bottom, in cramped handwriting, a peculiar phrase. She never forgave him. The pronoun hung in the air like a chill. Mirabelle's voice echoed again in my thoughts. Too calm, too prepared. People do not speak that carefully unless they fear their truth will betray them. I thought of her sister then, the faint smile in the photograph, the carved initials on the stone column. A life interrupted, a story told only through gesture and absence. Returning to my desk, I laid the letter beside the photograph. Two artifacts, each incomplete, each trembling with implication. Lewis would have said we needed facts. I knew we needed resonance. The case was no longer merely about Fell's death. It was about a past that had never been allowed to rest, a past that had shaped each of them in ways they were unwilling to admit. Outside, the rain eased into a fine mist. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest, a recognition, not of guilt, but of inevitability. A voice too careful is not a barrier. It is an opening disguised as restraint. Mirabelle Shaw had told me everything she intended, and far more than she realized. The truth, when it finally surfaced, would not come from what she said. It would come from what her voice refused to allow through. There are nights that do not slip quietly into memory, but cling to it, the way damp air clings to old stone. The night of the second knock was like that. Even now, years later, I can still feel its peculiar weight, an unease that grew not from fear, but from a sense of inevitability, as though the case had been leading me there with a patience I had mistaken for coincidence. I had returned to St. Anselm's after spending most of the day reviewing Fell's papers, trying to make sense of contradictions that refused alignment. The quad was empty. The snow flattened to a thin, icy sheen that reflected the lamplight in fractured shards. A faint wind moved through the cloisters, bringing with it the muffled hum of distant traffic and the subtle scrape of branches against the chapel roof. Oxford's nocturnal voice, low, restless, unwilling to sleep. Lewis had offered to accompany me, but I declined. There are parts of an investigation that a detective must walk alone, not out of pride, but out of the strange intimacy that certain truths demand. I made my way toward the guest corridor, hoping the space might offer some scrap of clarity. The building exhaled around me, timbers shifting, pipes whispering, the soft complaint of ancient hinges. A place older than its occupants, older than their secrets. As I reached the stairwell, the sound came. 2 knocks, the same rhythm that had haunted me since the beginning. Not loud, not urgent, but deliberate, confident. A gesture meant for someone who should already understand what it signified. My breath released in a slow, involuntary exhale. I felt none of the adrenaline Lewis would have expected. Instead, a peculiar calm seeped through me, cold and sharp, like water finding the cracks in stone. I followed the sound along the hallway, my footsteps absorbed by the worn carpet. Another knock, softer this time, as though the knocker had grown impatient, yet cautious. The door it came from was Fell's room. I paused before it, aware of the strange stillness pressing against my eardrums. The corridor seemed to narrow, the air thickening in that way it sometimes does before revelation. I pushed the door open gently. The room was dark, save for the faint glow from the window. The bed, stripped of its bedding, lay bare as a confession. The air held a faint scent of old paper and something metallic beneath it. There was no one inside. Stillness often feels like an accusation. I stood there, listening to the silence deepen, when the memory of Fell's unfinished line surfaced again. He will knock, but not as himself. I whispered it in my mind, letting the cadence settle. The man who had knocked twice was not Fell, and the one who had knocked tonight was not a ghost. I turned toward the corridor, scanning the shadows with that instinct I had long stopped trying to explain. At the far end, in the crook of the staircase, something caught my eye. Not movement, but absence. Someone had been there moments before. The carpet fibers were slightly disturbed, the pattern subtly crushed beneath a heel, the kind of clue only visible to someone tired enough to notice what others dismiss. I stepped closer. A faint trace of cologne lingered. A scent I recognized from Lane's office. Subtle, expensive, tasting of citrus and something darker beneath. It hung in the air like residue from a confession he had not yet spoken. Lane had been here, or someone who wished me to think so. I made my way outside, stepping beneath the arch of the stone gate. Snow began again, drifting in sparse, hesitant flakes. The night felt watchful. I looked toward the far end of the quad, where a solitary lamp flickered against the wind. The door of Lane's building closed at that precise moment. Not slammed, not hurried, but with that careful finality of someone who wished to hide the fact he had been somewhere else entirely. I walked back slowly, each footstep echoing faintly. The knocks were no longer mysterious. They were signals, shared once between Fell and Kersey, twice between Fell and someone he trusted too much. A code disguised as a greeting, an old ritual revived for a purpose that had turned sour. The second knock had not been meant to frighten. It had been meant to summon, and the person it summoned was not the one who answered. As I crossed the quad, a quiet certainty rooted itself in me. The truth was close now, close enough to breathe in the same cold air. But truth, like the night, does not arrive all at once. It emerges slowly, step by reluctant step, until it stands before you with a familiarity you wish you had never recognized. There are certain truths a man approaches the way he approaches a winter shore. Slowly, unwillingly, aware that the cold will not relent simply because he wishes it to. The evening I confronted Lane was one such shore. I'd walked across the quad in a silence broken only by the brittle crackle of ice beneath my shoes, the lamps casting faint halos on the thinning snow. Behind me, the college slept with that uneasy dignity shared by old institutions, full of pride, full of secrets, unable to distinguish one from the other. Lane's rooms were lit, though the curtains were half drawn as if he feared illumination, yet could not bear the darkness entirely. I stood outside his door for a moment, not to gather courage, but to steady the fragile logic that had brought me there. All the clues, Fell's unfinished line, the erased witness signature, the lingering scent in the stairwell, the photograph's silent gesture, had begun to cohere into a shape I could no longer ignore. I knocked once, then twice. A pause followed, long enough that I wondered whether he was rehearsing an answer. When he opened the door, his expression remained composed, though something in the muscles around his eyes betrayed fatigue or resignation. He gestured for me to enter, and I did so, aware of the subtle tremor in the air between us. There are conversations that begin long before either participant speaks. His rooms were as immaculate as before, books arranged with impossible precision, papers squared into careful stacks. A faint trace of the same cologne I'd recognized near Fell's door drifted through the space, a scent that tried too hard to appear effortless. Lane asked if I had come about some new development. I told him the case had reached the point where developments mattered less than motives. He sat, his composure tightening like fabric pulled into a final knot. He asked what I believed. I answered him not with accusation, but with recollection. My recollection of the night when Fell first knocked twice at the hall, and the night when someone else repeated the gesture, summoning not entry, but memory. I told him that rituals between old friends rarely disappear. They merely darken with time. Lane looked toward the window, as though the frosted glass might offer some absolution. He said he had heard the knocking too, once, years ago, when the woman in the photograph was still alive. She had used that signal when she wished to speak privately, away from Fell's insinuations. She had used it the night before. Her life took the turn from which she never returned. Lane said this without flourish, without drama, as though the memory had been stored in a drawer he rarely opened. And yet the drawer had always been unlocked. I let him speak. His voice thickened only when he described the way Fell had treated her, not cruelly in the obvious ways, but dismissively, with that particular brand of academic condescension that wounds more sharply than rage. Fell had intended to publish a paper referencing past events with a thin veil of anonymity. Lane feared the veil would tear. He feared the past would be resurrected not with tenderness, but with analysis. Scholars can dissect grief with alarming indifference. He asked whether I believed he had murdered Fell. I told him belief was irrelevant. What mattered was understanding. He exhaled, a breath that sounded like surrender. He admitted he had gone to Fell's room, had knocked twice with the old signal, believing it would open a door to dialogue. But Fell had not opened it. Not immediately. When he finally did, words had escalated, old wounds reopened, and a moment of anger, an anger Lane had mistaken for controlled, flared too quickly. He had not meant to kill him, but the dead seldom accept explanations. Lane's hands trembled then, very slightly like the wing beats of an exhausted bird. He said he had removed the diary page because it recorded something untrue, something he could not allow to stand against her memory. I realized, listening to him, that his guilt had grown roots long before that night. Fell's death had merely watered them. I stood, feeling no triumph. Cases rarely end with triumph. More often they end with fatigue and the dull ache of understanding too late what mattered most. I told him the formalities would come in the morning. He nodded, as though expecting nothing less. As I left his rooms, the snow began again, thin and uncertain. The quad lay silent, the stone gate watching over the college like an old sentinel. I walked beneath it, listening for the echo I had heard twice before. There was none. But in the absence of sound, a truth settled around me with the softness of falling flakes. The man who knocked twice had not signaled murder. He had signaled remembrance, and remembrance, I have learned, is often the most dangerous summons of all.